All right, welcome class to today's explainer. Go ahead and find a seat, get comfortable. Today we're going to be diving into American history, but we are absolutely not just going to memorize a rigid timeline of dates. No, we're going to look at this as a complex, living tapestry. We'll be examining the incredible triumphs, the brutal conflicts, and the really profound paradoxes that essentially built the United States from the ground up. Consider this History 101, the American experiment.
Here's our syllabus for the lecture today. We're going to move through 5 distinct epochs, starting with the initial collision of native and European worlds, through the forging of a new republic, the violent push westward, and finally, the devastating crucible of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, let's dive into this. Module 1, the collision of two worlds.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that long before Europeans mapped a single shoreline, the North American continent was already fully inhabited by highly sophisticated native societies. The New World was literally only new to the Europeans. But European colonization rapidly accelerated, starting with Columbus in 1492, which inadvertently opened up this massive frontier for global empires. The Spanish settled St. Augustine in 1564. Then, after some pretty disastrous early attempts like Roanoke, the English established Jamestown in 1607, followed right on their heels by the Puritans arriving on the Mayflower in 1620.
This brilliantly illustrates, though, that this rapid expansion didn't just happen in a vacuum. It came at an astronomical human cost. The brutal realities of this early contact are just undeniable. Introduced European diseases absolutely decimated native populations. And of course, mounting tensions over land sparked bloody conflicts, like King Philip's War in 1675, which nearly wiped out the native communities of New England. Furthermore, the economic engine of these early colonies was quickly built on human suffering. In 1619, the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Jamestown marked the horrific genesis of 2.5 centuries of chattel slavery.
Which brings us to a really fascinating Socratic question for you all. How does a push for a massive colonial empire ultimately breed the seeds of its own independence? Think about it. By the 1760s, Britain had defeated France in the global 7 Years' War, firmly securing their North American holdings. But that victory left Britain practically drowning in debt. To pay for it, Parliament decided to tighten its grip and heavily tax the American colonies.
Module 2, Revolution and Independence.
Over just a handful of years, the colonists experienced a dramatic, unprecedented ideological shift that transformed from loyal British subjects to fierce revolutionaries. And it all started with those taxes passed without colonial representation. The 1765 Stamp Act sparked widespread protests. Tensions boiled over into the Boston Massacre of 1770, and by 1773, that mounting outrage led to the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with harsh, punitive laws, and at that point, the fracture was complete. In April 1775, the famous "shot heard around the world" was fired at Lexington, officially igniting the Revolutionary War.
Now, consider this required reading for any student of history. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson and adopted on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence boldly stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." I'll just pause and let the gravity of those words sink in for a moment.
Those words fundamentally altered the entire conflict. Initially, you have to remember, this was merely a rebellion. The colonists were just fighting to reclaim their constitutional rights as British subjects. But the Declaration? It changed the shape of the war completely. It became a full-fledged revolution. They were no longer just fighting for representation in Parliament. They were fighting for complete separation and the creation of an entirely new sovereign nation.
Module 3, Forging the Republic.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that defeating the British Empire at Yorktown was a staggering achievement, right? But winning the war was honestly only half the battle. Now they had to actually build a functional nation, and their first attempt was, frankly, a massive failure. The Articles of Confederation created a remarkably weak central government. Commerce between states was totally chaotic, and the federal government was powerless to manage debt or even put down domestic uprisings like Shays' Rebellion. Realizing their mistake, they went back to the drawing board and drafted the Constitution in 1787, a fundamentally new blueprint featuring a brilliant system of checks and balances divided across legislative, executive, and judicial branches.
But getting everyone to agree to ratify that Constitution, that birthed our very first American political factions. The Federalists, driven by brilliant minds like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, argued the nation desperately needed a strong central government just to survive. Conversely, the anti-federalists feared a powerful central government would simply become a new tyrant, so they heavily favored state sovereignty. Ultimately, the Federalists won that debate, and George Washington became our very first president under this new, robust framework.
So, the young republic survives its early political trials, and very quickly, its eyes turn westward. But as we pivot here, I want to pose another question to the class. With the republic's framework firmly set, who pays the price for this new empire's expansion?
Module 4. Westward Expansion.
This entire 19th century era was defined by explosive population growth, massive land grabs, and this huge driving ideology known as manifest destiny. This was the deeply held belief that the United States was unquestionably, perhaps even divinely destined to expand its agrarian values and its territory from the Atlantic straight across to the Pacific. This idea spread like wildfire. It justified pioneers trekking the grueling Oregon Trail, drove the annexation of Texas, and fueled the Mexican-American War, which ended up adding over 1 million square miles to the U.S. map.
But manifest destiny came at a devastating cost. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act forced the relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homes in the East to territories way out west of the Mississippi. On the forced march known as the Trail of Tears, roughly 15,000 Native Americans perished from disease, starvation, and exposure.
Simultaneously, as native populations were being violently displaced, white settlers were absolutely flooding westward, totally motivated by the promise of unprecedented wealth. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. The resulting gold rush produced an estimated $550 million worth of gold at the time. To put that into perspective, adjusted for inflation, that is a staggering $187 billion today. No way, right? This massive explosion of wealth created lawless boomtowns literally overnight and rapidly accelerated the push to build a transcontinental railroad.
Module 5, Civil War and Reconstruction. As the nation expanded, its foundational original sin could simply no longer be ignored. You see, for decades, Congress had tried to hold the country together through this incredibly precarious balancing act between free and slave states, but that balance rapidly collapsed like a giant house of cards. The 1820 Missouri Compromise had maintained a fragile peace by geographically limiting slavery. But by 1850, the Severe Fugitive Slave Act heavily enraged Northern abolitionists. And by 1854, the policy of popular sovereignty, which basically let settlers vote on slavery, led to literal open combat in the territory appropriately named Bleeding Kansas. The political compromises had entirely failed. The tipping point finally came in 1860. The election of Abraham Lincoln, who strongly opposed the expansion of slavery, was the final trigger. Southern states immediately began seceding, leading directly to the attack on Fort Sumter and the outbreak of the American Civil War. To this day, it remains the deadliest conflict in American history. By the time Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in 1865, the astronomical human cost was realized. 600,000 American lives had been lost.
In the aftermath of all that bloodshed, the nation entered the Reconstruction era, desperately seeking to rebuild the South and integrate millions of newly freed Black Americans. So, the crucial point is the cornerstone of this era, the passage of 3 immensely powerful Reconstruction amendments. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. The Constitution was being fundamentally rewritten to finally secure these long-denied civil rights. Tragically, though, that progress was incredibly short-lived. Actually, scratch that. It was deliberately abandoned. Following a highly contested presidential election, a political compromise was struck in 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes was given the presidency, and in exchange, federal troops were entirely withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was officially over. The federal government walked away from its efforts to protect the civil and political rights of Black Americans in the South, completely paving the way for systemic disenfranchisement, horrific violence, and the oppressive Jim Crow era that would endure for another century.
Well, we've covered literal centuries of history today, haven't we? From the violent collision of 2 worlds to a revolutionary fight for equality that existed right alongside the absolute horrors of slavery and displacement. As I dismiss the class today, I really want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. How do the echoes of these profound historical contradictions, the incredible triumphs of liberty and the absolutely devastating failures of justice, continue to shape the American experiment today? Thank you all for joining. Class dismissed.